Hello there everyone, my name is Chris Unwin and I am a Solution Engineer with Redgate Software. Now today I'm going to be helping you figure out whether or not we can use Redgate Change Control for SQL Server with a Team Foundation version control project in Azure DevOps, and we're going to do so using a shared database environment. And as if that wasn't enough, we're also going to be making sure that we filter out any objects that we don't want to deploy. Fantastic. So how do we do this? Well, I have an environment set up. As you can see just here, I've got the DM database, dev, integration, and also a production environment as well for us to work on today. Now, to ensure that I was able to set this project up correctly, the first few things I did was made sure I had my dev, integration, and production environments. Of course, you can have different environments, it's up to you. But the first thing that I did was set up my Team Foundation version control project in Azure DevOps. Simply create a new project with a new repo and pick Team Foundation version control as opposed to Git. Now, of course, Team Foundation version control is a centralized version control repository, and it will actually involve us. Obviously, you can use things like Team Explorer Anywhere to do the commit of your changes into Team Foundation version control, but I'm just going to be using my Visual Studio IDE here to commit my changes to the DM database project. Now, once I created my Team Foundation version control project, try saying that 3 times fast, I think I just did. Effectively, what I did was open this in Azure DevOps in my Team Explorer, and you'll notice that it gives us access to a local path, i.e. a local path where those files are being staged to ultimately push into our TFVC repo. Now, of course, the next thing that I did once I had this local path was I added a file specifically to filter out my objects that I don't want to version control. So for the purposes of this, I used a DM assignment object. It's just a table, and I want it in dev and maybe in test, but for now, I just want to ignore it. It's an object that's not consistent across all of my environments. Therefore, I will handle it separately. I want to ignore it. The same principles go for things like users and roles and any other objects you may have that you want to ignore. Now, in my DM database folder, effectively I created a project, a Redgate Change Control project, and said, yes, put this project in my DM database folder, in that repository. Once I had created my Redgate Change Control project and said, what I wanted it to be called, etc., before setting my development database, because you have to pick a source, a development source, what I did was open up SQL Compare, and using SQL Compare, I generated one of these. Now this is a filter file. You'll know it because it is a .scpf or SQL Compare filter. And if we take a look in our repository in Azure DevOps and we open up that filter, you'll notice that where we've created it using the graphical user interface. But if we take a look at it under the hood, you'll notice that it says if my object name is like assignment, that object I want to ignore, then ignore it. Completely disregard it from everything I will put into version control. Ultimately, once you've delivered or once you've developed this filter file, it can go straight into the root of your folder where you're putting the project. As you can see, we've got the filter.scpf. We've got a bunch of other kind of JSON files more specific to our version control system. And then we've got our migrations and schema model folders as well, generated by Redgate Change Control. Now, in this case, we've got our filter ignoring the assignment. From there on out, we've then used Redgate Change Control to take an initial view of our schema model. So when you link it to your data source and do a commit, it will then say, okay, I have an understanding of the schema model, something that looks like this. We have a breakdown of our stored procedures, our tables, our views, etc. And we can see the state of these given objects in our version control repo thanks to Redgate Change Control scripting these out for us. Now, once we are ready to start thinking about generating a migration script as well, particularly a baseline migration script, you can absolutely do that by coming to Generate Migrations. Now, at this point, it will ask you to create a shadow database connection, and we have that just down here, DM database dev shadow. And this is ultimately so that we have something to compare against. So we'll be comparing the state of the schema as it exists in Redgate Change Control against our shadow database. Not a problem, fair enough. These migration generations and also the schema model changes, these will be picked up by Redgate Change Control, but will also take into account our filter file, our SCPF, so that assignment table will be ignored throughout. Now, once you've created your project, you've created your, in this case, filter.scpf, and once you have your initial baseline migration of an upstream environment as close to prod as possible, and your schema model, well, we can then get this into version control. Now, I've gone ahead and come into my Source Control Explorer in Visual Studio, and it's as simple as right-clicking within that folder and adding items to this. And fortunately, Visual Studio is just letting me add in any objects that I have changed or added in that time. So let's go ahead and add a new change to our database. Let's create a new table. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this one, let's say we've got, okay, the ID, there we go. This is going to be an integer. We'll make it a primary key. And we'll just put name, and we'll call it, let's do an nvarchar. Let's do an nvarchar 70. And then we'll go ahead and put fave Redgate Solution, because of course everyone's going to say my favorite data masker, or they might say Redgate Change Control. nvarchar 50, fantastic. So we'll say save that down, and we'll save that down as dbo.redgate user preference. There we go. Hit OK. X. So we should now have our new table, and there it is, Redgate user preference. Now we come on over to Redgate Change Control, and of course the first thing we do is refresh the schema model so that Redgate Change Control detects this change to the database schema and finds our Redgate user preference. It is showing us obviously the before and after. Table doesn't exist, and then of course afterwards we've got this lovely create table and the definition there. Now I'm going to save this to my project, and what you'll notice if we take a look in that folder, as soon as it's updated the schema model, we'll notice in the schema model option under tables, we now have the Redgate user preference.sql state file. So this is great for users to very quickly and easily share the state changes that they're making and saving to the project specifically. However, when it gets time to actually deploy some of these changes, we of course want to generate the necessary migrations. So by hitting refresh, what we're going to do is look at the defined state of our database as it has been saved to the project, our most recent version of our stateful changes, and it's going to compare that to our shadow database, and it's going to figure out what's different. Of course, naturally, only one change. So we select that change and hit generate scripts. Now it's at this point that we have a bit more control over how these changes might be deployed. Now, of course, if we're splitting a table, if we are doing anything that involves us including DML changes with our DDL changes, well, of course, that's where we can go ahead and say things like, first of all, let's give it a more meaningful name. So adding RG user pref table, there we go. And you'll notice that in this script, we have generated, using the power of the Redgate comparison engine, the necessary script to create our table for us. Again, if we wanted to apply a default or make any changes to this script so that it's deployed in a way that is predictable, reliable, repeatable upstream, we absolutely can do, and that will help prevent us putting data at risk. Now I can save this change down and hit finish. This will then in turn run that change against our shadow database. Excellent. This verifies that our migration script can indeed be deployed against that shadow. So we should be absolutely fine promoting this migration upstream against later stage environments. Now that we've finished, everything's good, everything's been validated. We can then, of course, come over into Visual Studio. I'm just going to go to Add Items to Folder. And actually, I'm just going to hit Finish. In fact, I'm going to go up one level and just say, yep, in general, DM database, finish, add everything, every pending change to my project, which includes our v4 migration, and of course, our new table. There it is in the schema model, so we can investigate this. And then over on the right, I'm just going to come to pending changes, and I'm going to check in my changes to Team Foundation version control with a comment. Added new table. Now, normally, of course, I would say why I'm doing something and maybe even relate it to a Team Foundation version control work item. That would be the smart thing. So I hit check in. Yes. And this has now taken those changes to my project and pushed them up into our Team Foundation version control project. So if we refresh, we should now have, there we go, v004, adding RG user pref table with the full definition. We have, of course, the schema model there as well. And if we come to pipelines, this has now gone ahead and triggered our pipeline to run. And this is leveraging the Flyway command line just on my local server. So effectively, as a result of this migration script, we've triggered a change, added the new table. This has now gone ahead and it's doing a 3-stage process. So the first stage is the build. And it's going to clean the build schema. So that's my integration environment. It's going to clean it down, get rid of every object. Then it's going to run our build. So this is going to run our baseline script all the way up to the most recent migration that we've generated. And then it's going to move on to an agentless job. And this is for me to actually review this so I can see if it has been run. So if we take a look at our integration environment, which should have now had these changes run against them, there is that Redgate user preferences table successfully created. So I can review that and sign it off. And this will then continue the process, move up to my next step, which is just going to use the Flyway command line to now deploy these changes to production. Now, there's a few things that I should point out. Number one, fortunately, when working in a shared development model or using the same dev database, as long as we have specific times where we're generating our migration scripts or a more controlled process over those migration scripts, it is still easier for us to share the same dev database and simply save changes to the schema itself, to the actual schema structure of the database, because then we actually have the firm code that we can more easily diff and then generate migrations later on for the actual deployments. Now, you'll notice also against my production and integration environments, I still have no assignment table. So that is because that filter file has only been used to generate migrations minus the assignment table. So for both state and the migrations within RCC or Redgate Change Control, there is no assignment table. Excellent, it's been filtered out. We don't have to worry about it being deployed upstream. And of course, we can build a lot more into this process. We can actually build in using, say, Redgate Deploy. We can build in the comparison engines themselves to check for drift against the target environment. Produce a changes report. We can run code analysis and our unit tests during the build and deployment process as well. It's entirely up to you. And of course, one thing also I should mention is that I talked about a baseline. One of the major benefits of having Redgate Change Control is having it build that baseline script for you. And when we go to deploy, we can assume that the base of our database minus our kind of individual objects that were filtered, as part of our pipeline, we can also set the flag on our upstream deployment process to actually baseline on migrate. So you can see that set here. And that's just going to ensure that when Flyway checks and sees all these wonderful new migrations to run against staging or production, if the Flyway schema history table does not yet exist, then it will effectively create that schema history table and then mark the baseline as applied. So the baseline that was generated with Redgate Change Control is marked as applied, as yes, we assume that this upstream DB, this source that was used to generate our baseline, is already in existence here, and we're just then going to run our incremental migrations. So we really are getting the best of both worlds, the flexibility, the ease of just saving changes to the schema model, but then also this flexible migration generation process, which can then be really easily and quickly built and deployed using that underlying Flyway technology within Redgate Deploy. And it's that simple. Yes, obviously, we are not using the version control tab within Redgate Change Control. This is because obviously we're using that working folder for Team Foundation version control. So you don't need to worry about that tab in particular. Hey, at least until potentially you move from Team Foundation version control to Git, or if you decide to move. In either case, Redgate Change Control is there to answer the questions for source controlling your database, working in either shared or dedicated development environments, filtering out objects you don't want to include in the pipeline, and of course, making sure we have a defined, repeatable, reliable upstream deployment process. To check out more, go to the Redgate website, and under products, you'll be able to find Redgate Change Control, have a look at some of the documentation, and of course, check out Redgate University for more. Thank you very much.